Hello and welcome to this series of videos where I'm going to be looking at the law firm compliance officer regime. If you are coming from a law firm, then you will know these as the COLP and COFA roles. So I'm Brian Rogers, I'm Regulatory Director here at Access Legal, and over the next 10 episodes we're going to dissect the Solicitors Regulation Authority's December 2025 thematic review of compliance officers. What they found should concern every person working in legal services. So during 2025, the SRA carried out its first thematic review of the compliance officer roles. That's the COLP and the COFA. So that is the compliance officer for legal practice and the compliance officer for finance and administration. This is a regime that has been in place since January 2013, and I have to say it really surprises me that it's taken this long to actually get the regime reviewed. I would have thought the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, would have been looking at this after at least 5 years, particularly when you look at how long some of the breaches we've seen recently have been going on. Average of 6 years, and in some cases breaches going on for 15 years. So you can see why, my view was this thematic review should have been coming about a lot sooner than it did. So when the SRA visited 25 law firms and asked 36 compliance officers within those law firms about their roles, and we're talking about 25 COLPs and we're talking about 11 COFAs, they discovered something remarkable. Not one single person reported any competition for the roles. Now, I have to say, having been in the profession for nearly 35 years, that does not surprise me at all, with the liabilities and responsibilities and everything else that is covered within the SRA's report. But, the fact is, zero number of people basically wanted those roles. But think about that. We're talking about mandatory regulatory roles that are supposedly the front line in protecting clients and maintaining professional standards, and absolutely nobody wants them. So what does this say about the compliance officer regime that we've actually got? Well, we're going to be covering a lot of that in the next 10 episodes. But in addition, firms do not appear to encourage individuals to internally apply for them. Now, you might be interested to know that I ran a webinar around this, as I say, on where were all the compliance officers. So if you really want to dig into the detail, then you might want to pick that up. It is a free webinar. You just need to basically register for it, and then you can pick up that webinar as well as all the other free webinars that we run. But what I want to do today is basically run through the responsibilities of these compliance officers. So in terms of the COLP, the compliance officer for legal practice, they're pretty much the kingpin around compliance in a law firm. So they have to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of their firm's authorization. If they don't, then the SRA can in fact withdraw that authorization. They need to ensure compliance by the firm, its managers, employees, or interest holders. So this applies to compliance involving everybody, not just perhaps your junior solicitors, your junior admin staff, but all the way up to the senior partners and equity partners and other owners. So this is a big responsibility. They have to ensure that the firm's managers and interest holders and those they employ or contract with do not cause or substantially contribute to a breach. So clearly they have a duty to make sure that on a day-to-day basis, people are doing as they're supposed to do. They're complying with the rules that are in place via the SRA codes of conduct for individual solicitors, but also for the firm itself. And of course, the firm rules apply pretty much to everybody in the practice, as well as the solicitors who have their own code as well. So in terms of non-solicitors, everybody who is a non-solicitor is in effect caught by the firm code. The COLP has to ensure that a prompt report is made to the SRA of any facts or matters that they reasonably believe are capable of amounting to a serious breach. So, for example, if they find that an undertaking hasn't been complied with, and there are circumstances around it that show that the vulnerable client was involved, that there's a lot of damage to the client as a consequence, then it may be felt that that is serious enough to report to the regulator. But this is where the COLP comes in, because they have to basically receive that information in the first place. They then have to dissect the information and work out whether, using all the guidance that the SRA provides and the rules that it has, whether in fact that is something that needs to be reported to the SRA. But they also need to ensure that the SRA is informed promptly of any facts or matters that the COLP reasonably believes should be brought to its attention in order that it may investigate whether a serious breach has occurred. So this isn't just something which you definitely know is a breach. You also have to report things which you're not quite sure about, but you think the SRA may need to make its own determination on that. And that is something which a lot of COLPs tend not to realise. So remember that one. So that's what the COLP is supposed to be looking at quite clearly. If we are seeing if we're looking at the data that comes out of the SRA's report, there are a lot of COLPs who clearly aren't fulfilling this particular obligation and role properly. So if you want to have a look at the report, then obviously you just need to go to the SRA website and pick it up. But the other key compliance officer that we've got is the COFA. That's the Compliance Officer for Finance and Administration. And they have to take all reasonable steps to ensure that the firm and its managers, employees, comply with any obligations imposed upon them under the SRA account rules. So clearly, they don't have the same level of responsibility per se as the COLP, because they're purely focusing on the SRA account rules. But that doesn't mean that the COFA shouldn't be talking to the COLP. And it is good to see from the SRA report that the vast majority of COLPs and COFAs actually talk to each other, which was really good, because there will be things that touch on each other's roles. So talking to each other is really good. They also have to ensure that a prompt report is made to the SRA of any facts or matters that they reasonably believe are capable of amounting to a serious breach. So again, an example is perhaps where a firm has accumulated a lot of residual balances over, let's say, 5 years. Well, clearly people are not doing their job right. And therefore, the firm, once they're aware of that, they should be picking that up and saying, well, actually, and I would certainly say this, they need to report it to the SRA because it's gone on for too long. Clients are at potential detriment. And we have to remember that, you know, a £20 residual balance to one person may be paying the next electricity bill if they're elderly or whatever. So there's the vulnerability aspect of this as well. And they also have the same obligation as the COLP, that they need to report things to the SRA if they think it's something that the SRA should make its own mind up about that. Moving on to our next section, we've got the appointment crisis. So zero competition for the COLP role. This is with an average annual turnover of COLPs of around 800. Now, we have a lot of people who are not keeping in with the role because their firm closes, but they're not included in that 800. So the 800 are people who are in active firms who are changing their roles on a regular basis. Now, around about 45–50% of COLPs have been in the roles for a long time, i.e. back to 2013. So when you bear in mind that all this sort of changing around is on about half of the firms, so we're talking about probably 4,500 firms based on the data that the SRA's got at the moment, you can see we've got a lot of churn on the COLP role. And of course, firms can't operate without a COLP. Existing COLPs, 84% are solicitors, are unlikely to find a replacement. So if we've got half of our firms and they're having a churn, or, like I mentioned, then how do we find a replacement? It's causing all sorts of issues. We've got 16% of COLPs who don't think they're the right person for the role. Well, what does that say about the regime? What does it say about the SRA and the authorization process, where it didn't pick up the fact that 16 people didn't think they were the right person for the role? Now, it may be that actually it was only once they got into the role that they then felt that they weren't appropriate for it. But if that's the case, why didn't they then resign and then let somebody else who was fit for the role come in? So again, there's all sorts of questions around that. Now, just to give you a little bit of a flavour, 75% of COLPs that are firm owners. And so, of course, they have a conflict of interest in reporting because their interest is in making sure their firm actually continues to be successful. So there is this real conflict there. The other 25% are employees, and of course they have career risks, i.e., do I want to challenge a senior partner and risk my future career with my firm? So again, there's a real conflict and tugging there of interests. The role is seen as toxic. So toxic was actually used by COLPs in the SRA's review. So it's coming from those people in the roles. So if they're feeling that it's toxic, then there really is a problem. And if we're not able to backfill the position, as they were saying, then again, there's a real problem there, because who's going to jump into that particular role? Would you take on a role and liabilities where the current COLP may not have been doing the job right? So what we found in the report was that new COLPs were not asking for a handover from the previous COLP. They weren't looking at the data that had been reported or recorded around the COLP role. So in effect, they were the vast majority of COLPs were taking on the role blind. They didn't know what had been going on previously, and yet they, from the day they took on that role, are in effect liable and responsible for all the things that happened on their predecessors' watch, unless they asked the right sorts of questions and they looked at the right sorts of things to make sure that reports had been made, that policies were in place, and all the other things that go with it. So appointments, they're driven by regulatory necessity in a lot of firms, not a strategic choice, i.e. people are press ganged into it. Well, that certainly isn't a good sign if people are being press ganged into something that they don't particularly want to go into. And a quote from, a quote from the report: firms don't encourage internal applications because there's a lack of interest in the role. Speaks volumes. And yet every firm has to have one, and they have to have one all the time, unless they've got authority from the SRA for temporary cover and things like that. So if we're losing COLPs at the rate that I mentioned earlier on, we're then not able to replace them. And they've got to meet all the requirements around having the appropriate experience, knowledge. They have the appropriate authority as well. Again, that comes down to, can the COLP actually challenge senior partners and things like that? Then, the bucket of people who will be qualified for that particular role can reduce significantly. We've then got the recognition problem. So only 44% feel valued by their firms. Well, that speaks volumes about the culture within that firm. And it's because we have that conflict again. The COLP is seen as a barrier to doing business, i.e. no, you can't do that because that breaches these rules or whatever. I used to find when I was in practice as a COLP, we didn't have the regime in place at that particular time, but certainly I was acting as if I was the COLP. I did have to basically say to the partners sometimes, I'm sorry, but we just can't do that. It's too high a risk and it's just not worth doing. And so you do need to be able to say no, but it's whether you have the authority and the wherewithal to do that. Most receive zero financial recognition for additional duties. So if you're not going to get paid extra, should you be paid extra? Well, I would suggest that maybe if you're not a partner, then yes, perhaps, you should be paid extra. If you're a salaried partner, I think you might want to sort of say, well, actually, I'm taking on more responsibilities. I think once you get into owner COLPs, then they have a vested interest. They shouldn't need to be paying themselves extra to make sure their businesses are run properly. But you can see where the issue is there. Only one compliance officer got a pay rise for taking on the role. Again, speaks volumes out of 36. And the compliance on the cheap quote was from a retiring COLP. So again, you can see the sort of cultural issues that we've got there. In terms of a career dead end, 39% of COLPs reported that there were no career benefits to being a COLP. Again, our cultural issue comes to the fore there. And 33% see some knowledge gain. Well, that's great, but if it's only 33%, there's another 67% where they're not getting the knowledge gain. So culture again. And 33% feel viewed as more senior. But what would it be? And this is a question I've always asked ever since the COLP regime came in. Under the Legal Services Act, it actually talks about a head of legal practice and a head of finance and administration. I don't really understand why, but the SRA decided to change it to a compliance officer for legal practice. Now, if you had somebody with head in the title, would they have more authority than somebody who perhaps is just seen as a compliance officer? And so would that 67% who don't view themselves as more senior, would they have changed their view had they had the title head of legal practice? It's a question that perhaps needs to be answered. Overall, though, the role is seen as a burden rather than an opportunity, and that is really, really sad, because compliance is a core element of running a business. So not seeing it as an opportunity to get things better and be able to sell yourself as a truly compliant law firm, it's not a good sign. The succession crisis, 16% of COLPs were retiring imminently. There was nobody waiting. There were issues around succession planning. Are they looking to close the firm? Well, again, I've come across some people who are now retired where I was saying, you need to put in succession planning for compliance and all that sort of thing. And they were saying, oh, well, I don't care because I'm going to retire in 6 months' time. Well, it's a very selfish view to take, I think. Unless that was your plan as a one-man band, if I can call it that, just to basically close. Well, fine, okay, I suppose that is the succession planning. But the fact is, I suspect a lot of junior partners will be looking to take the firm forward once the senior partner has retired. Well, again, they need to make sure that everything that they're picking up from that senior partner is where it should be and should have been for years. So just closing, when nobody wants a regulatory role, when it's seen as a career limiting exercise, role, whatever you want to call it, rather than career building, when firms won't pay extra to do it, you don't have a compliance system, you have what I call regulatory theatre. It's playing at it, in effect. It's that sort of tick box mentality again, isn't it? Now, next week, we'll explore what happens when people who don't want the job are expected to know obligations they've never been properly taught. And the knowledge gap, believe it or not, is staggering. Thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll see you at the next episode. Bye-bye.